All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics seminar series. Today, we have a special guest, Daryl Burdon. He's a marine biologist with over 20 years of experience in interdisciplinary marine research, teaching, and consultancy. He's run his own company since August of 2019. And before that, he worked at the University of Hull as an ecological economist working with the Institute of Estuarine and Coastal Studies, IECS, from 2002 to 2019. His research interests relate to linking natural and social marine sciences with expertise in natural capital approaches, economic valuation, and stakeholder engagement. He's published widely in this field with over 30 publications, 6 book chapters, and over 100 reports. And he really draws on this research experience, teaching both at the universities Hull and Aberdeen. He's currently been active and involved in the management of the Humber Estuary for over 20 years and is currently the chair of the Humber Nature Forum in the UK. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Daryl, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks again for inviting me to share some of our research with you. It's a great opportunity. So as John says, my name's Daryl Burdon. I'm an independent researcher now based in Hull, in the UK. And today I want to introduce some of the work we've been doing in Northern Ireland, but also to try and take that a bit further, look at some of the work we've been doing in Europe, trying to link marine habitats and economic values, and introduce this spatial scaling methodology for valuing societal benefits. So just a quick structure of the seminar, really just to introduce myself, to make it clear I'm not an economist, and try and make that point very clear from the start. So I'd like to introduce my background, acknowledge some of the funding of the work that I'm going to present today, run you through two projects really. The first project is the project we've just published in ecological economics, which is based in Northern Ireland, in the UK. And then we've been trying to develop this work a bit further as part of a European project. And that's work which is currently ongoing, but we'll try and present some of those findings for you today. So my background, I'm a marine biologist. I studied marine biology in Stirling back in the late 1990s, and moved to Hull just for a year to do an interdisciplinary master's. And that's where I first got introduced to environmental economics by Professor John Atkins, who's a co-author of the work that I'm presenting today. I've worked with John for the last 20 plus years. So I've do a lot of work with environmental economists, but I'm not an environmental economist myself, more of an ecologist. But all my research really tries to span that link between the sort of natural sciences and the social sciences, and in particular, the application in the marine environment. So after my master's, I was employed, as John says, by the Institute of Estuarine and Coastal Studies at the University of Hull, where I worked for 17 years as a researcher. And since 2019, I left the university and set up my own company doing research and teaching. And I also work part-time for the International Estuarine and Coastal Specialists Group, led by Professor Mike Elliott. So my background very much is that kind of linking natural and social sciences, in particular, looking at ecosystem services, natural capital, and also economic valuation. So just a quick acknowledgement. Obviously, the funding, the main body of funding was received from AFBI, which is the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Northern Ireland, who funded the initial work. But since then, we've tried to develop the work a bit further, and we acknowledge funding through the Horizon Europe programme, through the Marbefis project. So first, I want to introduce you to the Northern Ireland Manaka project, which is the marine assessment of Northern Ireland's marine natural capital project. And this project basically had three main objectives: to provide a baseline of marine natural capital in encompassing the entire worth of the marine environment in Northern Ireland. Um, Nested within this assessment, they were keen to have an evaluation of the MPA network in Northern Ireland. And as part of that as well, they wanted us to develop a framework to provide a decision support tool for strategic management of marine spatial planning. So this is the project that I'm going to present today. Just to give you a bit of context, obviously that's a map of the UK. Northern Ireland is a small green area north of Ireland itself, the pink country. So this is the area we're looking at, and in particular looking at the marine waters off Northern Ireland. As I say, this work's just been published last year, now in ecological economics. So that's obviously where you can find a lot more of the detail that I'm presenting today. But I will acknowledge the fact that the method is a development of a method that was published back in 2010 in ecological economics by Hussein et al. And that we've developed their work a lot further based on some of the updates in methods, updates in data, and updates in sort of different applications since that work was published. So the idea is really based around this conceptual framework, especially in the marine environment. And this is a conceptual figure that we produced for the UK marine environment specifically, which recognises that the natural environment is made up of elements of stocks of natural capital, which could be habitats or species or the processes that go on. These can deliver a flow of ecosystem services, which we define as the functions and products from natural capital, from which we can turn into societal benefits. And I guess the key aspect of this figure is that the fact that all of these processes are going on in the natural environment. If society want to gain benefit from some of those ecosystem service flows, then these are termed the societal benefits which take place in the human domain, but also recognizing that complementary capital, whether it be built human or social capital, is often required to obtain those benefits. And when it comes to economic valuation, as I'm sure you're all aware, it's these societal benefits, this kind of human end of this conceptual framework, where our interest lies. Obviously, I don't need to tell you all about double counting in economics, but again, this is framework's been developed in a way so that we focus purely on the societal benefit from an economic perspective and to avoid aspects to do with double counting. So this is the kind of conceptual framework we came up with for the Northern Ireland project. And there's been an increasing amount of literature available on national level natural capital accounts across the globe. And this is shown in the right-hand figure here, where we have this kind of good understanding of the economics of the benefits that the marine environment provides, but at a national level. We know that natural capital stocked, and for this project, we're focusing purely on habitat extents, so the marine habitats. So we're not taking into account the species of the water column, but just the seabed habitats that are available. And we know we've got that information at a national level, but we also have that at a much more local level. So we can look at, say, national, regional, or local level, and we can access that sort of data relatively easily. But when it comes to the benefit side of that figure, we generally have a good understanding of the national level findings now, but what we don't have is that kind of local level understanding of how valuable the local marine environment is. And this was really the concept that started the whole project, where we were keen to say, okay, well, if we know the national level values of societal benefits, if we can find a way to assign those to the national amount of natural capital, to the actual habitat extents, we can then, by disaggregating those national level values based on the habitat extents, then we can start to zoom in on the benefits to a regional or a local context. And in essence, this is the kind of conceptual framework that set the project going. And I'd like to explain how we've tried to develop a method to allow us to enable us to do this. And again, I'll come back to this figure at the end of the presentation just to kind of summarize where we've got to and what direction we're going in. So within Europe, there's a set framework of how we designate or how we define particular marine habitats. This is broken down in UNIS levels. So the marine habitats are all level one. These are then broken down into six different types of habitats, which are level two habitats. And again, these are further broken down into level three habitats. So we know what types of habitats we have in the marine environment. These are either mapped or they're surveyed. And we have these maps available for the whole of Europe for under the UNIS classification scheme. So taking Northern Ireland as our case study, you can see here on the left-hand figure, that's the UNIS map for the UK. Then we've zoomed into the Northern Ireland marine waters in the middle. And then because the project was very much interested in sort of marine protected areas and their value they can provide within Northern Ireland, that the map on the right there shows the Northern Ireland Marine Protected Area Network. So using GIS, we can find which habitats are available in which places. And from that, we can quite easily extract the different amounts of each different habitat at UK level. We can then zoom into the Northern Ireland marine waters and find out the makeup of the different habitats there. And likewise, we can then in the final column there, we can zoom into the MPA network itself to kind of look into it different scales. So that's one part of that figure to start with. We now got a good understanding of which marine habitats are available in which of the different areas. We then looked at the other end of the scale, and we're looking at the societal benefits. So within the framework that we've been working with, there are 14 particular societal benefits, and within the UK, we've developed marine natural capital accounts. And from these natural capital accounts, we can start to get an understanding of the national level values of some of these societal benefits, and in particular, the UK national marine natural capital accounts include things like fish capture, flood protection, carbon sequestration, wastewater remediation, and recreation. So we know we're starting to get a good handle on some of this information. Within the UK, we have data available for these different benefits from 2008 to 2019. So we've got a good time series data, and obviously all the methods that of the way that the valuations have been done for these particular benefits are all provided and are all publicly available. So just to show you an example, looking at, say, the first societal benefit of food, whether that be wild or farmed. And this is the type of information that is provided within the natural capital accounts, broken down into different countries within the UK, whether that be Scotland, England, Wales, or Northern Ireland. And it shows you that annual value, both in quantitative terms, in terms of tons, but also in value terms, in million pounds in 2019 prices. And again, that data is available from 2015 all the way through to 2019. Likewise, things like healthy climate. We've got quite a good understanding now about the carbon sequestration function of a lot of habitats within the marine environment. And by using a quite straightforward arrangement where we can convert the actual area of particular habitats, we've got a good or getting a good understanding of the sequestration rates. So how good are those habitats at sequestering carbon? We can then convert these into CO2 equivalents, and then obviously use things like the non-traded price of carbon to generate carbon values. And within the natural capital accounts, that they're focused very much on those top three, the salt marsh habitats, the sublittoral sands, and the sublittoral muds. However, we've taken it a stage further than the natural capital accounts do. We've also included things like intertidal sediments, seagrass beds, and shellfish beds. And what you'll notice from this type of data is that we, within the literature, there's a range of different sequestration rates that can be used. And so what that can result in is a range of different valuations of that benefit, of the benefit of the different sort of carbon sequestration rates. So quite often when we present the actual valuation or the economic values at the end, we can present a range of a low or a high range of different values. So this is the kind of output from where we're looking at the national level. We found using the natural capital accounts, the national natural capital accounts for the marine environment in the UK. We've got information about food. We've got information about the healthy climate, sea defence, waste burial, or bioremediation, tourism and nature, as well as aesthetic benefits. And different methods have been applied. I can't go into detail into them all today. Obviously, in the paper that they provide a lot more detail about how these numbers are produced and generated. We've also, for a couple of other benefits for education and research and for health benefits, we've taken values from elsewhere in the literature, obviously converted them all back to these 2019 prices to try and look at the total value of that environment. So we've got the two ends of the spectrum, if you like. We've got the habitat extents at the national level, and we've got the valuation at the national level. But the key is to really how we disaggregate that national level values across to a more localized level. And the way we did that was based on the work of Hussein et al. Back in 2010. They came up with these four different criteria. Where possible, we try and use if there's scientific evidence to say how important a particular feature is in providing a benefit, then we can use that relationship. And we've done a lot of work in the UK on that. We've published that as the matrix approach, and I'll show you how that works shortly. But that's where we've got good scientific knowledge to know how important a particular habitat in providing a benefit. And by doing that, we know how we can then use that relationship to split that particular benefit across the different habitat types. Going all the way down to if we've got no scientific justification of how habitat types are split, then the worst case scenario is you split the value of that benefit equally across all of the different habitat types. And as the UNIS habitat classification showed, there's 28 different types of habitat. And therefore, the worst case scenario, if we didn't have any scientific justification of how we can split that data, is we then just split it equally across those categories. So again, it shows some limitations, but it's a means to try and start the process of trying to look at the valuation data available. So just to introduce the matrix approach, this is something that we generated with Tavis Potts from the University of Aberdeen and others, where we looked at the different protected features in the UK. We looked at the ecosystem services and the benefits that those different features provide. We then made an assessment of how important they were in providing that benefit, whether they're making a significant contribution, a moderate contribution, or a low contribution. And that's a relative assessment based on the different habitat types. We came up with a confidence score, whether it's based on expert opinion or whether it's based on grey literature or overseas literature, or whether it's actually based on UK peer-reviewed evidence. So we've got some sort of indication of how confident we are in that valuation data. And again, we did it for many different types of features. And we came up with these matrices, which I don't expect you to be able to read on the screen, but we included 30 different habitats protected under European legislation, 30 habitats protected by new MPA legislation within the UK. We also did the same for species, different species protected within MPAs within a European context, also highly mobile or low or limited mobility species within UK MPA legislation. And this is the sort of information it can provide. And this is something that we use quite a lot with stakeholders to show, for example, under different management scenarios. If, say, for example, we wanted to change a muddy habitat into a salt marsh type habitat in say, a managed realignment type approach, then it shows relatively the importance of those habitats in delivering these different benefits. And those concentric circles represent obviously low, medium, and high. So it's a way to kind of engage stakeholders and try and look at the relative distribution or the relative importance of particular habitats in providing those benefits or the ecosystem services that underlie them. So we've got this information available within the UK, so we could take that to our advantage and be able to use these scores, convert these scores into an approach to show how relatively important those different habitats are in providing the benefits. So we ended up with this, which was the final matrix. You'll notice for 3 of the benefit types out of 14, we had no scientific justification for how the relative importance of splitting those, and therefore they were split equally, or the value that the national value was split equally across those different habitat types. For the others, we had evidence from the matrix approach. So we took that from the literature and from the stuff we'd published earlier. And basically, it shows that those red cells are those relationships between habitat being very important in delivering a particular benefit. Likewise, the orange ones are a moderate importance, the yellow ones are low importance, and the green cells are a kind of no or negligible importance. So we've got a scientific understanding of the importance of habitats and species, so we can use that to split the values at the national level down to the habitats at the national level. And then by doing that, we can then start to zoom in to the kind of regional level or the local level and have a look at actually how do those values change and how can we look at valuation at a smaller scale. So these are sort of outputs we get. So we can look at the kind of the main object, or the first objective was to look at the Northern Ireland marine environment, to look at its potential benefits generated by the Northern Ireland marine environment, and we can present that either by benefit type or by habitat type. And this just shows the total benefit provided by the UK marine environment in using 2019 prices. It also shows the total value of Northern Ireland marine waters. Again, using 2019 prices. And again, we can zoom in and look at the actual current value of the Northern Ireland MPA network. So this is taking those 3 different, this kind of 3 different scales into account. Again, we can show that data again based on habitats rather than the actual values. You see the total values at the bottom are the same, but we can start to get an understanding of actually which habitats are providing that value. And that really sort of achieved the first objective that we were aiming to do, and that was to look at the relative importance of the marine environment in the UK and look at what contribution Northern Ireland marine waters makes to that overall environment. Our next task was to look at the MPA network itself and to say, okay, within Northern Ireland waters, how can we start to look at the MPA network and how the value of that network could change depending on what management objective we set. So, based on, again, following the work of Hussein, they came up with these two very generic management regimes, looking at a recover management regime, which is the kind of hardest management measure, if you like, where you prohibit the most amount of activity, and hopefully that will then enable the environment to recover. And obviously, by having a healthier marine environment, you're more likely to deliver those services and the benefits associated with those. It also had a maintain management regime, which is what most of the objectives are currently in the MPA network. And this is showing that the current activities can still go on. There are still certain activities restricted in those areas, but there are certain activities that can still go on in those areas. So taking this into account, we could start to generate or start to look at what's the potential impact on the benefit. So this kind of schematic really just shows about these different MPA scenarios. Taking, for example, a level of 1 is the current time of the value going across a 20-year period. And we know that if we did nothing to the marine environment, we didn't protect any of the marine environment or the activities that go on there, then you'd expect a steady decline in the benefits produced, in the value of those benefits over time. And we assume that would be a decrease from, say, 1 to 0.5, for example. If we went for the maintain option, the maintain management option, then obviously we'd remain that the implicit value of the marine environment should remain constant across that 20-year period. However, if we went for the more restrictive management option of a recover option, then you'd have this kind of sigmoid curve where you might not notice any change for a few years, but as time went on, after maybe 5 or 6 years, you might start to notice that a real change or an increase in value. And again, how big that increase is, when that increase happens, will depend on what management option were in place and what habitats or what restoration you were looking at. So again, we started to play around with some of these figures, and again, the model we've produced, we can adjust these relationships. But this is the type of approach that we've taken. From doing this, then we know that we can generate these different scalar codes. And again, this is taking on the work that Hussein and colleagues did back in 2010. And you can start to look at these different relationships based on three different parts of a scalar code. So you look at the magnitude of the change. How big do you think that management regime will have on the delivery of a particular benefit? You can look at the period of that change. How many years will it take before that benefit is realized? You can also look at the profile of the change. Is it going to be a linear relationship, or is it going to be more of a sigmoid curve relationship? So based on these different criteria, we can then generate for each different habitat and each different benefit, the relationship there, a scalar code of what would happen under a recover management option, what would happen under a maintain management option. And by doing this, it allows us to adjust the values of different management options and look at actually how changing the type of management that goes on in an MPA may have an impact on the economic value provided by those sites. So this is just an example that we provide in our table in the paper, and basically the relationship here is the information on the left hand side of that table is looking at 100% maintain management option within the current MPA network. The right hand side of that table is obviously looking at changing that to 100% recover. So that's going from a kind of the two extremes, if you like, of the MPA network. But if we looked at a kind of realistic scenario where we're saying, okay, moving from 100% maintain, if we actually increased the management of 25% of that network, you start to see maybe an increase up to, say, £30 million in value increase. So it allows us to play around with different networks, to look to play around with actually what happens if we start to increase the protection of that network. And again, doing it very much from a hypothetical perspective. We're not looking at which particular parts of the network are going to improve. We're looking at the network as a whole. And this type of value that does show that it really can make a big difference as to what potential value you can get out of a system, depending on what value or how much of a particular network you have a very highly protected marine area compared to a marine protected area where certain activities can still go ahead. So again, this allowed us to start to play around with different scenarios. Again, you can start to look at the outputs. So look, this is looking at the net present value over that 20-year period using a 3.5% discount. It starts to show which particular habitats are most important in providing the benefit, but also which benefits are actually providing most of the value as well. So using like this kind of heat map, it starts to look at that network and starts to say, well, actually, this is where the main benefits are coming from. These are the sort of the benefits that are being improved under that management regime, or these are the habitats that are protected that actually provide most of it. So it starts to give managers or planners a bit more information about what happens by adjusting certain things within an MPA network. That is fine. We had a series of spreadsheets set up to enable us to do that. But what happens is, as soon as you got more information, you had to then rerun the whole all the different spreadsheets, make all the changes, and it became a bit kind of a laborious exercise. So what one of my colleagues, Steve Barnard, did, he took those interlinked spreadsheets and generated a kind of decision support tool known as the Beach tool, which stands for the Benefit Evaluation through Assessment of Component Habitats tool. And basically, it made it more accessible to estimate different values to make it more accessible for a much wider range of stakeholders. To make it very clear what this tool does, it's an Excel tool that basically automates the disaggregation process that I've just mentioned. It focuses only on the marine habitats. It doesn't include the water column and marine species, like we said. It really is just taking part of that component. When we talk about natural capital, quite often you'd include the water column and you'd include species as well. So we're only looking at one component of the natural capital. It includes all of the marine benthic habitat compositions, but it doesn't take condition into account. So it assumes that all habitats are in the same condition. It uses the matrix approach to provide that appropriate weightings for the disaggregation process. And again, it's driven by UK national data. It doesn't generate new data. It's very much you need that national level data to be able to drive the tool. So you need that national level data not only for the economic side, but also for the habitat extent side. And it currently includes 9 out of 14 of those societal benefits in the tool. And again, it provides an underestimate. It doesn't include all of the different benefits, but again, it's a starting point for where we can go. So just to give you a bit of an idea of what the tool looks like, I don't expect you to look at necessarily the detail, but what it does show is that it shows on the kind of on one page, it shows what the valuation data outputs are for the table I've already shown you. It produces everything in real time. So if you make any adjustment to a value, if you get new valuation data, you get new habitat extent data. By changing those different types of habitat extent, it will then run the whole model for you straight away. So number two there is that breakdown of habitats. Here it's got the UK, Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland MPA network habitats in there. But there's no reason that couldn't be anything else. It could be a site in England. We could look at England. We could look at, say, the Humber catchment where I'm based, and we could input different makeups of that marine habitat data in there. And again, we could input different valuation data from the national capital accounts, for example, or from other studies. So any data interested, and obviously the outputs will follow suit. Again, you see there's a slide bar there where that slide bar will allow us to adjust for the maintain to recover option. And again, that just gives the user a bit of flexibility. So you can start on a 0% control, 0%, 100% maintain, 0% recover, and you can drag that slide bar along and you can adjust those relationships within that network. And again, we can also add additional sites to the network. So we can look at current network and we can add additional sites, which are shown in that section 4 there, where again, all we need is the makeup of the habitats from those different sites, the area of each different habitat, and we can just plug that in there, and it'll then give you an output which not only shows you the value of the UK marine waters, the value of Northern Ireland marine waters, the value of the MPA network, but also it will identify the value of additional sites that you may add to your network, and also additional whether those additional sites would be under a maintain or a recover scenario. So again, this tool's been built. The methodology runs anyway, but the tool's been built to really help us and to use as an engagement tool, but also to allow us to update with additional information as and when required. So just to conclude for the first part of the study, for the Northern Ireland component, it generated the indicative values that they were looking for within the Northern Ireland marine waters. It showed the impact of changes in different MPA scenarios, in different management scenarios within that network, and showing that they can be quite significant increases. The example I showed, for example, that 25% increase in the network of recover scenario could lead to an increase of in the region of £30 million increased value. And again, by having that tool that allows us to try and make the process more efficient, and it also allows us to use it as sort of an engagement tool as well, to work with stakeholders to look at the different values that we can generate from such a tool. So we took that work, we published that work last year, and we're also involved in a European project known as MARBEFES, which is looking at trying to link biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, and societal benefits across the whole of Europe. And as part of that, we're working on a work package which is looking at ecological, economic, and socio-cultural valuation tools. And it's across four main seas, four main European seas, from the Arctic through the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and the kind of Atlantic. And within each of those four seas, we have these different test sites, if you like, different case study sites. And in particular, we're working on a site in the Irish Sea, in the Irish Sea BBT, the Broad Belt Transect. And we realized that we've got the beach tool built to work for Northern Ireland marine waters. However, if we took that broad belt transect, we could actually apply it to other areas. So we started to try and adapt the method to apply it not only within the UK, but outside the UK, within Ireland, but also within the rest of Europe. So just to give you an idea, the Irish Sea BBT is that dashed line in between there. So you'll see the Northern Ireland marine waters above that we've just been talking about. But this is including a tiny bit of Northern Ireland marine waters, but it also includes Irish marine waters. It includes a bit of English marine waters and also Welsh marine waters as well. So a lot of that we already have the data for. We already have a good understanding of the values associated with that type of approach. So in order to run the beach tool again for a European perspective, we had to update the habitats that were included. The UNIS habitat classification framework that we used has been updated. It now has 42 different habitats. The advantage of that is it's the same habitats that are used throughout of Europe, the whole of Europe, irrespective of what sea it is. And therefore, by us updating the methodology to be the most up-to-date habitat extent, then it can be applied anywhere in Europe. Again, the economic valuation, we'll focus on those 14 societal benefits, and we're very much interested in the national values of those benefits. And the matrix approach, again, is based on the UK habitats, so it's fine for the Irish Sea BBT, for example. But again, that matrix approach may need to be tailored if it gets moved outside the UK and we want to try and apply the approach elsewhere in Europe. But again, it's those three components that we need. If we can get an idea of the habitat extent, the national level economic valuation, and an understanding of how important the features are in providing the benefits, then they're the three components in essence that we need to run the tool elsewhere. So as I say, that the UNIS habitat classification has changed. We now have these 42 different categories. And again, it just shows how that biogeographic spread of the different seas in Europe. So we're focusing very much in sea number 2 in the Atlantic. But also because we've got case studies in the Mediterranean and the Baltic Sea as part of the Marbefis project, then again we could look at maybe trying to roll out the beach tool and see if we can get it working for the Irish Sea BBT. Then there's no reason why we couldn't look to try and get that information for those other components. So that just shows you an image of the marine habitats within the Irish Sea BBT. And again, it's using the latest UNIS habitat classifications. So we've got that information. We've got the information at a UK level and a European wide level. So we have that information, no problem. We know from a valuation perspective, we've got the Marine UK National Capital Accounts. We've used a lot of that information already. However, Ireland is outside of the UK, so we need to look at how we can use valuation data for Ireland itself. It doesn't do marine natural capital accounts at the minute, so we've had to look into the literature to try and find out what valuation data is published. Is it suitable to use? We're very conscious of the fact that we need data that's been collected or generated for in a particular way to be comparable. But there's no reason why. Hopefully, we can get it up and running for that particular site. Again, the habitats and the relationships for the UK, we've updated those to reflect the change in the different features. But that's a very straightforward walkover between the habitats that were there or the classification of habitats were there and the new habitats. So we're quite happy with the matrix approach. Again, it works for the UK and the Atlantic waters. We'd need to maybe tweak it in the Mediterranean, for example, or the Baltic, if the relative importance of particular features in that different natural environment the actual scores may need to be tweaked because, for example, salt marsh habitat in the Atlantic might not be as provide as much benefit, for example, as salt marsh habitat in the Baltic. So we need to think about how we can adjust those relationships and tweak those relationships. But I think we've got quite a good understanding. So what we're hoping is that we can apply the tool and the method to the Irish Sea BBT at least, and then hopefully try and roll it out to maybe trying it somewhere else in Europe to see if the same sort of approach can be used. I think we've demonstrated that the approach does work. And it's really a case of this is very much a work in progress. We've got a couple of years left in this project where we can try and roll out some of those findings. To really go back to where we started from, just to end the seminar, I'm conscious of time. I'd like to leave some time for questions at the end. Um, we by taking those national level habitat extents and those national level values, and we found a way to try and disaggregate those national level values to based on the habitat extent. And by doing that, it allows us to zoom in and generate values at the local scale and the regional scale, which is something that hasn't been possible. There's the occasional, say, smaller scale case study where we can get economic values at a very local level. But this hopefully allows us to look at a much higher level and be able to zoom in from that higher level to a more sort of regional, more local level and generate economic valuation data. Again, as I don't have to tell you on the call, there's a lot of caveats associated with a lot of the methodologies where a lot of these valuations have been undertaken. However, I'm very much of the view that in the past we've just assumed if something's too hard to value, we just don't value it. Problem then is that a lot of policymakers or a lot of planners assume it has a value of zero, where actually what we're starting to do is starting to put these ballpark figures out there to say the methods aren't perfect, the valuation data itself isn't perfect, but it starts to show and give an indication of actually the marine environment around us really does provide value. We can start to play around with those numbers. We can, as more and more data becomes available, we can update the tool that we've got. We can update the method, and that's one of the real sort of key parts of this project was not to just produce something that works now, but something that can be very easily updated. And by generating the beach tool, what it's allowed us to do is when we've got updated data, we can then plug that new data into the tool, and then obviously move that on and update it as we move forward. So I think I'll leave it there. It's been a 40-minute presentation. Many thanks for listening. Does anyone have any questions on what I've just presented?
Well, I put something in the chat. I'm John
Go ahead.
Sorrentino. Can you take a look at it?
So there's a question in the chat from John. It says, very impressive work, methodological question. A hydrogeologist at his university argued with his use of expert opinion to show the relative importance of parameters in a water quality index for major local creeks. It was not, quote, scientific. As an ecologist, do you find its use acceptable?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question that because we classified the lowest level confidence, if you like, as expert opinion. However, sometimes the experts actually maybe just haven't published that, or it's a relationship that is very well known but hasn't been published, and therefore I don't think it's a problem to ever use expert opinion. I think it's something that we use, especially in the marine environment where it's very expensive to get a lot of the data. We really trying to use it, and governments are trying to understand a lot more about expert opinion, how we can bring expert opinion into decision making, because we don't have the answers to everything. And expert opinion, I think, is a fair way to do things. But again, it's got to be recognised. Who's the expert? What is it? What are they expert in? But also the way we've done it is to make it transparent. And I think that's one thing that's very important, which is why we wanted to include this kind of confidence interval or a confidence score, just to say, well, actually, it is based on expert opinion. And if we got scientific data to back that up, then I think a lot of people would look a lot more detail into that. But so yeah, I think there's no problem using expert data or expert opinion. How that gets drawn into a lot of the work people do is varying. Within the UK especially, expert opinion is getting taken on board more and more. So I think that's not a problem from our perspective. And again, ideally you want the money to go out and do the sampling and to do the analysis and have kind of statistically significant stuff. But a lot of the work that I'm involved in, we're doing a lot of work with local coastal communities, for example, and getting them to map their own habitats based on their own local knowledge. And again, it's not scientific, it's not being done in a scientific way. However, the data we're generating from that is actually very, very powerful. And it's almost like digitizing local knowledge, which is a really powerful tool, I think.
Uh,
So
Okay,
hopefully that
thank you.
answers your
Good
question.
answer. Thank you.
There's a couple more questions. Alejandro, did you want to ask yours or want me to read it?
Yes, thank you, John. I can do it now. Thank you, Daryl, for your presentation. Very interesting. Um, I was wondering, Daryl, if you are familiar with this critique that the confidence in these kinds of valuations is undermined by them being shadow prices. Shadow prices are defined as estimated monetary values assigned to goods or services that are not being actually traded in the marketplace. Of course, this critique normally comes from free marketeers. I'm not one of them. They say that to the extent that these figures are not the product of market rivalry, they are approximations at best. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on why these values are important, however approximate they are. Just giving you a
Yeah.
space perhaps to hammer home your message.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think there's especially in the UK, there's been I've done contingent valuation surveys, discrete choice experiments. We've done lots of different valuation surveys over the years, and I know exactly that there's two sides to the argument about whether we should be putting monetary values on things that don't have markets, for example. Um, but I think it's very important. I think it's very important, but very important to include the caveat of how important it is, or where that data's come from. And there's been a big change in the UK, for example. So the government's Green Book, which is the government guidelines for they're more than willing to include things like some of those non-market valuation methods now, and they're starting to recognise them. And they do have, as you say, they do have limitations. But if they're used in the right way and they're interpreted in the right way, and I think this is one of the biggest problems we have, and it's always a bit of a caution for us when we deliver this sort of tool, is the fact that anyone could pick up the tool and just press some buttons and get some answers. But actually, unless you understand the data that's getting put into the tool, how that data is being collected, what methods and how robust the data is, then you can generate numbers very quickly, which could quite easily get out of hand. So I think it's very important to include the stuff, especially the non-market valuation side of things. A lot of our work, we look at the kind of socio-cultural valuation type work. A lot of stuff we don't actually put monetary values on. A lot of it we'll work with coastal communities to look at what they find important, how they sort of connect with the marine environment, for example. So there's lots of different arguments for and against. But I'd say, yeah, I think there's no problem at all using some of these methods. Governments are now taking them on board. They're more than happy to support them, which is a big step. Because obviously, if a lot of people are working in that field, but whatever output they produce is kind of undermined by the government, then that's something that I think that we need to look at. But again, everything has caveats, and as economists, I'm sure you're all more aware than I am that there's a lot of caveats associated with a lot of this work. However, what we are doing is really starting to recognize what value the marine environment provides and how that value can change depending on how we use the marine environment. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Daryl. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Tanya.
Hi, Daryl. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and your delivery was also really good. The marine ecosystem service valuations have been challenging in my experience. There's always kind of this caveats of all the gaps kind of being in marine environments. I was very inspired by the work you've shown here. And I'm wondering how easy is it to take this framework, these tools, this set up and apply it to more distant applications beyond the European environment. As an example, Caribbean countries. How much effort is required to take this approach? And I love the consistency, where we can maintain consistency and comparability. That's very valuable, but how much of an effort does that require? And where do you see the biggest gaps kind of likely to emerge? And likewise, where are there the most opportunities for transferability?
Yeah, I think so. A very good question. I think that's kind of where we're currently trying to think. Okay, how much it's been developed in particular for a kind of quite a local sea area. We want to try and expand where it can be applied. But again, the methodology is a standard methodology. That's a transparent methodology. And what we're really interested in is what data is available at the local scale. So in the Caribbean, for example, if you know the different habitat types, if you know the values of the particular benefits provided, if you have that sort of information available, and you have some sort of indication of how important the habitats are in providing those benefits, then the approach can be used anywhere. It can be used in the terrestrial environment, it can be used in the marine environment, it can be used anywhere around the globe as far as we're aware. The difference is how much understanding you have of those key relationships. And I think that's the key to the whole process. In the UK, we were fortunate enough to have developed a marine framework, so we knew what benefits we were looking at. We were fortunate enough that we developed using the same framework, the kind of matrix approach. I know now that the matrix approach has been applied elsewhere around the world, so they've taken on board the same sort of idea. Again, the matrix approach could be based purely on expert opinion if required. So you could get a team of experts in to say, well, actually, the relative importance, we're only talking about high, medium, or low. It's not like we're looking at a very scientific process, but what we're doing is saying if we can do it transparently and we can look at relative contributions, then I don't see why it can't be used elsewhere. But it depends on where you're starting from, I guess, as to how much of that information you have. We know that the matrix approach has been used in Finland now, in the Baltic. We know I think it's been used somewhere in New Zealand. I think we found papers on. So I think the idea behind the approach is it's almost like we call it a bit of like a quick and dirty approach, because it's not best science. It's not all. If we sit around waiting to if you think about how complicated those matrices are, the number of features we have, the number of benefits we have, and each cell has to have an individual score in it. So this very much is a way to identify where the interest may lie, which things aren't particularly important, which things won't be affected by a particular management option, but which ones potentially could be. And therefore, you then zoom into those and you start investing research funding or consultancy funding to try and look more detail into that area, if you like. So I think it can be applied. It really depends on a kind of case by case basis as to what that baseline level of understanding is. Do you know what habitats you have? Do you know what benefits you have? And do you have some sort of relationship? Do you know roughly which are the most important benefits provided by which habitats? And again, we work with stakeholders. We'll work with stakeholders at the minute to try and get them to generate some of this information to try and say, okay, well, what benefits do you get from the marine environment? And it's amazing what local communities, not from an academic background, but from just their knowledge of what they sort of benefit from. Do they know where that benefit comes from? Which particular feature provides that benefit, and so forth? So I'd say, yeah, it's possible, but it's early days, and it'd be interesting to see where else it could be taken.
And there's another one from, hopefully I pronounce this right, Madhu. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. My main question is about the protected areas, whether your recovery efforts lead to more protected areas, and do you see any Do you have an evaluation of the societal benefits from protected areas? And is there a particular time limit for protected areas? So I think it's mainly about your analysis of the protected areas and how you can move forward in that particular area.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as I say, that our tool doesn't generate new data, for example. It uses data that currently exists. So when it comes to the scenarios analysis for the MPAs particularly, it's very high level. We're looking at a kind of we're looking at relationships of kind of maintain and recover, and looking at a network as a whole. A lot more is coming out in the literature about how effective MPAs are, how long the MPAs have to be designated for, and a lot more literature is starting to look at a case by case basis of actually what values do those smaller areas provide. But we find that it'd be an interesting study, but I think when we're taking national level values, once you get down to a certain point, if you're looking at maybe a very small MPA, then how valuable is this approach? Our approach is very good at a network level, and we can start to look at kind of how you can apply that approach to a smaller scale. But there's no reason why. So the methods have been set up like the figure I showed with the different relationships between those different management options. The tool's been built so that we could adjust those. If somebody said actually it'll take 10 years before you start to see any benefit, it won't be 5, then we can move that sigmoid curve along that time frame. So it's got flexibility to try and play around with different options. But again, there's a huge amount of literature, or a growing amount of literature in there across the globe. And we're just looking at the minute, we're doing a review for Natural England at the minute, looking at how natural capital approaches have been used in MPA management across the globe. And it's kind of it's a developing science, I think. And it's really interesting to see how some real world data can fit into this model, which at the minute is quite conceptual. It's quite hypothetical. But again, if for example Northern Ireland turned around and said actually we want to increase our MPA network by 50%, where's the best place to do it to get the most value? We can start to look around and say, well, actually, by sort of manipulating it in GIS, we can start to say, okay, well, these are the habitats we need to aim for because they provide the most benefit. Or you could end up sort of potentially sort of identifying MPAs based on what benefit you want rather than what habitats and species we want to protect. It might be a case of saying, actually, we want to set up an MPA for carbon sequestration. And then you look at actually, well, which are the habitats that provide most of that benefit? And therefore, where should we be targeting our next MPAs, for example? So, yeah, great question. But yeah, I don't have all the answers, but.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Do you work with the natural capital folks at Stanford?
No, so we don't work with. I'm not aware of some of their work. We have our own sort of natural capital folk forum and committees in the UK. But again, so we're aware of some of their work, and some very good work coming out of the States in various different elements. But we don't. At the minute, we're not directly working alongside them. No.
Okay, well, I don't see anything further. So want to thank you, Daryl, for a wonderful presentation, very informative, and I know I learned a lot, and I think everybody else did as well. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you very much for inviting me, John. It's been a pleasure. And as I say, I've sent the slides on to John. So if anybody wants to copy the slides, then please feel free to share those around. That's no problem whatsoever.
And before we go, I'll just remind everybody our next seminars will be January 24th, Emmy Christie, and on January 31st, Veronica Lupi. So you'll get announcements for that, and hopefully you'll be able to attend. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending, and a special thank you again once again to Daryl. So have a nice weekend, everybody.
Thank you very much.